Well, thank you, Chris. It's great to be here. Making great places is the business that the county board is in, and making sure that our community has a lot of great places for all the folks who live here is something that I think all five of us think about, or four of us for the next 2 months, think about every single day. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Bruce this evening. Bruce has over 20 years of experience designing and executing mixed-use projects throughout the United States and in Europe. While he was directing design for Cooper Carey's Main Street office in Alexandria, Virginia, he played a key role in many important projects. Among them are Misner Park, Bethesda Row, Santana Row, and Crocker Park. Currently, as a Streetsense partner, Bruce is master planning and creating development strategies for several large mixed-use projects that combined total more than 200 million square feet of development. Prior to joining Streetsense, Bruce was a vice president at Starwood Urban Investments, where he was responsible for managing and directing the evaluation strategy and design of all new projects. He actively writes and speaks about issues that are related to urban development. He has served on the faculty of the University of Shopping Centers. I didn't know there was such a thing as the University of Shopping Centers at the Wharton School of Business, and he has co-authored multiple publications for the Urban Land Institute. So, Bruce, welcome to Arlington. We're delighted you're here, and I will turn this over to you.
Hi, thank you. Can everybody hear me? Great. I'm going to use this mic rather than the other one so it can. Well, thank you very much. I'm glad to be here. I think you're going to find this a really interesting presentation, hopefully. I know I find the subject of retail really fascinating. I've been involved in retail for almost 30 years now. John, I hate to admit it, but we've been around for a long time. Streetsense, a little bit, I'm a managing partner at Streetsense. Streetsense is a real estate company really focused on retail and mixed use. We really touch retail from all facets, from brokerage. We represent about 60 national retailers, over 100 local and regional. We're involved in store concept development, operations. We're involved in store design, strategic planning and rollout strategies, all the way to coming up with base building analysis. So we really touch retail really at a lot of levels, from the finest of grains to the macro. I think today, really, the changes that we're seeing in retail can't be overstated. I think they're really profound. Probably, I would argue, probably the most profound in the last 100 years. I mean, there are really some radical transformations happening. And I want you to remember 2008, because I think, for me, that's the real pivotal point where a lot of coinciding factors started to converge. Some of them were caused by the subprime, which happened in 2008, but some were just coincidental. But it's a real pivotal period for me in retail. Let's talk about some of the macro issues that are really facing retail. The first was, from 2001 to 2008, Wall Street was driving a lot of retail expansion. And in order to show growth to the investors, I think a lot of retailers, in hindsight, threw out some sound rollout or real estate strategies, and really just was growth for growth's sake. And I think when the subprime happened, it gave a lot of the committees and executives for a lot of the merchants time to sort of sit back and pause and reflect on where they were. And I think a lot of them look back and said they probably have way too many units in the market. Some think and feel that they have as many as 50% too many units right now in the domestic market. That's a pretty significant amount of oversupply. So what you're seeing now, and you're seeing this reflected in a lot of B and C malls, is as leases are coming due, a lot of these merchants that we all know and love, they're pulling back, and that's why you're seeing a lot of vacancy occurring. So not only are our top national merchants not in a period of expansion right now, they're actually in a period of contraction. And in real estate terms, that's really significant. The other interesting thing that I think is happening is, you can see in the statistic to me, which is really revealing, is the US has twice as much retail per capita as the UK, which has twice as much retail per capita as Canada, which in turn has twice as much retail per capita as Australia. So with retail contracting, you can look at this table and wonder, and nobody knows how much contraction is relevant to our nation, but One could argue that 50% of the retail might have to be repurposed in the next 10 to 15 years. These are pretty significant statistics that those in the development industry, like John, are really paying attention to because they're a little scary. The other interesting thing that happened, and it was somewhat related to the subprime, but probably something that was inevitably going to happen, was there was a transition between the boomers, which were probably the quintessential shopping generation for the last 20 years, to the X and Y and millennials. And it happened for two reasons. One, it was just destined to happen, and the other was basically the boomers lost, in a way, half their net worth temporarily overnight, and that was a kind of psychic shock to their spending habits. So, now that they've recovered their net worth, they're still not spending like they used to, and what happened is the X and Ys and the millennials are now kind of stepping forth and becoming the predominant shopping generation. Well, that generation shops much differently than the boomers do. They're much more fragmented. They're very brand aware, but more brand indifferent. The boomers were very much focused on brand and were much more monolithic. So what that means is the retailers, apart from dealing with this contraction, they're also now adapting to a new series of shopping patterns that the millennials and X's are driving. So these are significant changes. So we're in this really strong adaptive period among many of the merchants in the country. The other interesting thing about the millennials too is while the boomers were much more focused on owning things and stuff, the millennials right now, at least the current trends, is they're much more interested in renting and using a lot more innovative things like Zipcar. So fewer of them own cars, which also drives a lot of industry. So you're seeing these sort of macro trends really starting to reflect itself dramatically in retail. The other thing, which everybody's been talking about for years, was the internet. Now, in 08, up to 08, the internet shopping really wasn't competing dramatically. It was a lot of hype and overstatement, but it wasn't really having a dramatic impact on bricks and mortar retail. Today it is significantly having an impact, but not what you may think. Some may think, well, it's going to replace retail. It's not really replacing retail. It's competing with retail at certain levels, but what it's really doing is changing the way the merchants are doing business. So you take somebody like REI, Crate and Barrel, or Best Buy. Basically, they're using online to supplement their sales, much like catalogs were, to a lot of these merchants. So they're not necessarily in competition, but what it is it's really affecting their store size and how they merchandise, because people will use stores to purchase certain items, and they'll use the internet to purchase certain items. So what the stores are trying to figure out now is what is the correct mix of merchandising and how big do they need to be. The obvious statement is they don't need to be as big as they used to be. So a merchant like Best Buy used to be 50,000 square feet. Most of the merchandise was kept on site. Now they're having online distribution centers. People are going and looking at the TV, doesn't fit in their car anyways, and they're going home and ordering it online and having it delivered. So you're seeing, a merchant like that might only need to be 25,000 square feet moving forward. So when you have this massive surplus of retail, you have this period of contraction happening, and then you have the merchants really not needing to be as big today. All these factors are really dramatically impacting how much retail we really need to have in our markets. The interesting thing then is, well, where is retail going? Well, what we see a lot of is retail is going what we sort of say is more experiential or immersive. So a lot of the commodity shopping is online. A lot of the commodity shopping is done, sort of periodically, less frequently than it used to. But people are using retail much more for immersive or recreative experiences. People are eating out a lot more. Another interesting thing about the X, Ys, and the millennials is they eat out a lot more than the boomers. What's an interesting thing is when I was growing up, my mom would make one trip a week to the grocery store. She would stock up all her supplies, and I pretty much knew Sunday night what I was going to eat Thursday evening, right? Today, most people don't know what they're going to have to dinner until about 4:30 in the afternoon. And what you're seeing is a lot more frequent trips to the grocery store, a lot more spontaneity, and a lot more eating out. So you're seeing this massive growth in what we call QSR, which is quick service retail or restaurants. So there's a lot more selection. Quick service retail used to be Wendy's and McDonald's and maybe Chick-fil-A, and now you have this incredible breadth of organic and focused fast casual dining that, offers particularly in urban environments. And that's really, retail is not a leading use. It really responds to demand. So you're seeing these kind of trends affecting the growth of retail. The other interesting thing is the retail right now is really being focused in urban markets, not necessarily in downtown, although we're seeing that. I'd say 75% of our leasing now is inside the Beltway, where pre-08, 75% of our leasing was outside the Beltway. But you're seeing in markets like the Ballston corridor, which is, somewhat urban now. It's really, in the last 15 years become a really urban market. You're seeing a lot of focus from the merchants in these corridors as well. And again, much more focus on food and entertainment as much to specialty retail. So having said that, strategy really is key to success today in both from the planning perspective, but also from the development perspective. Pre-08 used to see a lot of speculative retail. So you'd see people building centers, putting a few signs in the window and leasing them up. You don't see that. They're incredibly hard to underwrite today. So you need leases or at least LOIs really to get the investors interested in the project. And really, when you combine the other trends I'm saying is you really have to be targeted in your rolling out of retail, because if you don't understand the market, if you don't understand the competition that's around you, you're going to have a lot of vacancy. And certainly you can see that somewhat in our markets where the substandard retail largely is vacant. And that's the other critical thing to really remember about retail. Among all the uses from residential to office to hospitality or hotel, retail really is the most binary. So by that is, it usually either works or it fails miserably. And you really have to be sensitive to that when you're talking about retail. If you missed the design of the market, you have too many for apartments, you have too many 2-bedrooms, maybe your 1-bedrooms aren't big enough, or maybe you have a galley kitchen and you should have had an area for dining. You'll still at the end of the day rent that apartment and it'll still produce income. Retail tends to stay vacant. So you have to have a high level of sensitivity to the underwriting and really strategy in your rollout. Now, when you look at the different prototypes, I was on a show last week on it was a European show, which is interesting because a lot of the trends we're seeing in our nation aren't necessarily characteristic of what's happening in the rest of the world. But we're talking about the death of malls. And, you have to be really careful because basically today, the A malls, like take in our market, Tyson's Corner is, considered an A mall. That's doing the same great numbers it's always done. It's an incredibly viable, mall. And I think long-term it's going to be very sustained. But we are seeing in our market a number of other malls that aren't doing so well in B and C locations. Lake Forest Mall in Gaithersburg, you're seeing Landmark Mall, you're seeing Springfield having to be reinvented. So you're seeing a lot of these other locations are really struggling. And when you go nationally, you see a lot of second and third tier cities with malls that have lost all their first tier national tenants and are trying to desperately backfill with other uses or other, probably less quality retail. But that's not to say that malls aren't relevant. It's just that we're going to need fewer of them. When you look at power centers, that's the same thing can apply, that there's a lot of stressed power centers in the nation, but there are still few that are doing quite well. The other thing this sort of chart I always think is interesting is this cyclic nature of retail and how patterns tend to repeat. But, back in the turn of the century, leading up into the 50s anyways, downtowns were where all the shopping occurred. So people tended to live downtown, and that's where all the merchants was. And then after the 50s, with the advent of the interstates and the growth to the suburbs, and the introduction of new prototypes focused around the car, you saw really a lot of the downtown, this sort of urban-focused retail, sort of diminish. And then, the malls were starting to be replaced and hammered by the power center. So you see how these competing trends. And now, ironically, we're coming back to a more urban and downtown-focused retail. So for the Ballston-Roslyn corridor, that's really a good thing because that corridor is essentially urban. It's essentially relevant to the consumer. It has the ability to provide an immersive and engaging environment for the retail and the consumer, which is what they're looking for in their offerings. So there's a lot of trends now that are working back to urban areas like the Boston-Roslyn corridor that are really favorable. But having said that, each one of these prototypes is sensitive to density. So we really have to be careful about today, what is the right amount of retail density? Because often what we find in projects is when you get too much retail density, you end up what we call filling slots. And that usually affects things like co-tenancy. Co-tenancy, what is co-tenancy? Co-tenancy is, in retail, it's about matching the quality and nature of certain tenants because there's synergy in retail. So when you start having a good collection of tenants, but then you have a lot of vacancy and you have to put in substandard tenants, it devalues the quality of the existing tenants, and that can actually create a negative trend where they start pulling out of the project. So you really have to be careful with those types of issues. So what's really sort of key today is, I've used this term a couple times, but it's like immersive. So people really like to use their retail offerings to, basically to create an experience for themselves, and also that tends to be where a lot of the retail energy is focused and a lot of the use downtown. So what does that really mean? I think it means basically that we're seeing a lot less specialty retail and a lot less kind of growth in these sort of areas. The other interesting thing is basically pre-08, when we were in a leasing discussion, there used to be really two aspects that were asked by the merchant. One was, is this a good location for me? And two is, what's my co-tenancy? In other words, who else is in that market and what are their numbers and how are they performing? So there's a real strong correlation between, is this a good location? The interesting thing is now that the trends are moving towards these sort of immersive markets and immersive experiences, design is starting to play a really important role in the performance of retail. And planners have been talking about it for a while. We in the design field, or John in the development field, we always understood that design is somewhat important. Now the merchants are really catching on to the importance of design. And I've got a couple of examples here locally that I'd like to share with you that sort of drive it home. Before, that used to be a matter of opinion. I think today there's a lot of empirical evidence proving that the design and execution of real estate is really important to the performance of the retailer. And now becoming a third point in discussion in lease negotiations with tenants is the design of the environment is really key. They're seeing and tying their success of their unit to the design environment that they're in. So if we go downtown, Washington's DC City Center, it's a new project, on the old convention center site. Everybody would agree that's a tremendous piece of real estate, centrally located. Tremendous opportunity for retail. What's interesting is the architect and the development team, which was partly driven by the city, but there's a really hardcore modern aesthetic to this project. And what's interesting from our food and dining tenants is basically there's a lot of pushback from them when they show up now to the site. They look at a lot of plate glass, a lot of sort of sterile environment, and the alleys being so tight that they're not understanding the project. And if you look at what a retailer is looking for, say I'm a restaurant concept, in order for me to be successful, if I'm a Lebanese concept, for instance, I need to kind of get you in a Lebanese frame of mind really before you get in the store. So if I'm going out to dine and I show up at a lot of plate glass, I'm not in that frame of mind, So the design and execution of the storefront becomes really critical for getting the consumer to kind of really feel that this is a romantic and desirable place. And modern architecture has a lot of advantages. Romantic is not a term you'd ever apply to it. Okay, so what you're seeing here is they're really having a hard time. I'm not saying this project won't be successful from a retail perspective, but they're having a really hard time leasing this project today. And I think pre-08, John, you think they'd be having as much trouble?
No.
Yeah. So what's interesting is there's no numbers on this, but if you go to 2 blocks away, okay, to F Street, This street does well over $1,000 a foot, and in retail terms, that's a pretty good number. That means they can support rents, you know, $70, John, $80 a foot. And why are they doing that? Why are the retailers so successful? Well, one of the obvious things is it has historic context, right? So it's got a lot of, you know, we call urban fabric. But with that urban fabric comes interesting storefronts and sidewalks, so it's diverse, right? The other thing is, on the new projects they've built across the way, it's what I call a retail-friendly architecture. So they've allowed the base of the building to sort of be customized by the merchant, and they have a lot of character and definition. So, you know, we use terms like it's modulated, you know, it's varied. But essentially, the third component it has too is it has a really nice mix of local, national, and regional tenants. And that's also something that's really important today, because some of the trends I was telling you earlier was in the overexpansion of retail brands, it was two things. One, there was store cannibalization. In other words, you know, you take a national fashion retailer, when they became in every mall, they started to cannibalize themselves in the sense that, you know, you had your choice between going to, say, Landmark to Springfield to Tyson's. It was the same store, so there was some cannibalization. But I think the more important thing that happened is when you go from having few units to you're everywhere, you become a commodity. So you become kind of a little ho-hum in the eye of the consumer, and they want to get their exclusivity back, you know. So I think the XYs and even the boomers now are a little more indifferent. They're sort of brand aware to the national brands, but they're more indifferent to brand. But what they're really focused on is urban context and contextual use. So a lot of our restaurants that are regional and local do much better numbers now than the national national restaurants, because they're much more in demand by the consumer. They're much more interesting, they're more unique. And so when you see this sort of merchandising mix that mixes great national tenants with local and regional, it really resonates with the consumer, and that's reflected in the sales per square foot, because in retail, people vote with their wallet. So that's kind of an interesting example. I'll take an even more extreme example. So this is a project probably many of you know, and it's the Shops at Wisconsin Place. It's right in the heart of Friendship Heights. It's, you know, to me, it's a really handsomely designed project. It was a first-tier developer and a really well-known and national design firm, excellent design firm. And they have some of the top national retailers in the country. You know, Sephora, Anthropologie's there. They've got Bloomingdale's, Nine West. You know, they've got a whole collection of what we call first-tier retailers. The issue here, you know, but this barely does $500 a foot. Okay, it's in a market with an average household income of $260,000. So the trade area for this is just, that's one of the highest demographics I've ever seen. And it's barely performing. And in fact, if the merchants weren't national, all these would be out of business right now. Okay, so why is that? Well, there's a variety of reasons. One, it doesn't have a mixture of local and regional complementing the national. It's all national. And as I mentioned, the consumer today is a little ho-hum about the national retailers. So, you know, having this mix is really important. The second thing is environment. So even though it's a handsomely designed project, in my opinion, this project could be in Los Angeles, it could be in Atlanta, and it could be in St. Louis. So there's really no contextual reference for the project, and it's a little vanilla. And then there's an absence of, you know, street trees and other shading devices. And when you're talking about an immersive experience, right, you like to spend some time and hang out. Well, in the summer, you're baking to death. And if you look at these photos, they're not staged. This is kind of like the way it looks. So you never see anybody with a shopping bag, and it's pretty sterile. So, right. So, you know, this is not to really bust on the developer, but to really just say that, or highlight that retail is an incredibly complex thing to execute, and you have to get today a lot of variables right. So you can't, in the old days, you could get the merchandising to rock and you were pretty good, and today that's not the case. So if we go up the road a little bit to Bethesda Row, it's one of John's company's projects. The average household income here is still outstanding. It's about $110,000. average household income, which is, by national standards, very, very healthy. But this center performs at over $1,500 a foot blended, so over 3 times the sales per square foot, which from John's perspective reflects in very high and lucrative rents and a lot of sales tax, for the county. But why is that? Well, the other interesting thing is it's got a really great mix of local and regional tenants, along with some great nationals like Apple, which, by the way, in this location does about $10,000 a foot, which is just absolutely stratospheric. I mean, it's really remarkable, some of the numbers. And the other interesting thing is it's got a lot of engaging ground plane. It's got great street trees and shade. It's got, every storefront is totally different. And so it's got a lot of modulation. And then the other interesting thing with materials, too, is it's got a lot of variety in wood and steel, metal, ceramic, stucco. So it's got a lot of diversity. And to me, these 2 examples really highlight how important design is in the performance of immersive retail today. I mean, it's, to me, not a matter of opinion. I think it's just so documented. And you can see this in other projects. If you would go around the country, you'd see where the top performing centers are, and you can see a pretty strong correlation between great design. So what I thought would be fun is, you've heard me talk a lot about the demographic changes, and I think these are really significant changes that are affecting retail. And I think to really understand maybe where we need to be going and what we need to be focused on, I think it's helpful to kind of look at the millennial and really start to understand, what it is they're looking for, because essentially, at least for the next, probably 10 to 15 years, retail is going to be heavily focused on this generation. And, retail, again, is not leading. It always follows demand. So it's going to be morphing and modifying itself to really complement the needs and wants of this generation. So the millennials are really a pretty significant generation. They're the largest generation in history. There's 80 million millennials. Those are people born after 1982. They represent 25% of the population. And I see a lot of boomers here, but you can see that they're slower to get married and much more dependent on their parents than our generation. I think I went off to school when I was 18 and I never lived at home again. I think I can't tell you how many my peers have kids even graduated still living at home. So they're a much more clingy and somewhat dependent generation than the previous, and a much more just calling the way it is. But the other interesting thing I thought was interesting is the boomers. We were such a monolithic generation. So all my partners are boomers. Every one of us has an iPhone. When I was growing up, Adidas were the hot shoe. Every one of us wore the Adidas. And what we find today with this oversaturation of brand is the millennials are they're brand aware, they like brand, but they're brand indifferent. So my son, for instance, who's about 19, he'll wear Reebok, or he'll wear Under Armour, or he'll wear Nike. He doesn't really prioritize one better than the other. He goes for value, which one's on sale, and which one's the right color, but he's not really making a decision necessarily on brand, although he does like to wear brands. So that's a really kind of key component from a retail perspective now. How do the merchants really captivate this new generation and inspire them to buy their product over something else? This is something really important. So I'm going to give you a true or false quiz on the millennials to see how you do. Okay, so true or false? 59% of Gen Ys identify themselves as city or urban based. We hear a lot about the Gen Ys being an urban generation. How many think 59% are focused on urban markets? True? What do the millennials think? Any millennials? True? False. So one of the interesting things about millennials is that, 40% of them are heavily focused on urban markets, and that's not an insignificant amount of focus, right? But there's also a lot of, and that's the interesting thing about this generation, it's a lot more fragmented. in their preferences. Where we were so monolithic, there's all kinds of subsets within your generation. Some of you are very boomer-like, and some of you are more bohemian, and some of you are more focused on the environment. So there's a much broader breadth, and that affects your spending and living desires. So you're seeing here a fairly equal distribution of, suburban versus urban versus country, which I think is really kind of an interesting component of your generation. So true or false? 45% of you have an annual household income exceeding $50,000. How many think the millennials exceed 50? False? You think false? True.
Really bad at this.
45% have an annual household income exceeding $50,000, which is really, really significant. And you're seeing these trends in our city, right? Because if you look at, I think there's something like, John, 12,000 units coming online downtown. And they're really focused on this millennial generation. They're very small, heavily amenitized units. So, you look at the old apartment buildings. I live in an old apartment building, so I've got this kind of rickety health club, and I've got a mail room, but the mail room only handles letters. You go to the new buildings downtown, but my unit's really big. You go to the units downtown, really small. Some of them are like 450 square feet, but the buildings are amenitized. They have coolers for food being delivered through Peapod. They have big mailboxes because everybody's getting all their goods online, and they're not home. So they have the mailroom's like 4 times as big as it used to be. They have deluxe health clubs, and they have all kinds of other, click cafes and all these kinds of things to serve. And they're much more focused on not living in their apartment as much as living on the street and living in the amenities. The other interesting thing about that is we're seeing a lot of retail becoming, used to be an economic driver, it's becoming an amenity use too for a lot of these buildings. Okay, true or false? Nearly 50 million Gen Ys visit a big box center once a month. False? True? True? Who says true? Who says false? Okay. True. So 50 million, which is 50 million of the 80 million, significant, visit a box center. So that's what I was saying earlier, is everybody wants to say, oh, the power center's dead, the mall's dead. Certain components of them are dead, but some of them are still viable and heavily used. So what you're seeing is a much more diverse array of retail and how we're using it. The other interesting thing is, what you're seeing is some of these dependency, or, it's not dependency, it's really just the relationship of children. The boomers' parents to their children was much more different than the boomers' relationship to the GI generation, where the parents were much more disconnected. You're seeing a lot more sort of integration in the family structure, and you see that reflected in the retail offerings as well and how people use retail. So you're seeing a lot more integration that way. All right, true, false. 40% purchase groceries at least once a week. How many think they do it once a week? 1. Okay. False. 65% purchase at least once a week, and most admit that they go more than once. In fact, I would say the average trip to the grocer is 3 to 4 times a week. And the interesting thing, let's talk about grocery stores for a minute, is I gave you that story earlier about my mom, how she used to go every weekend and get the whole week's groceries and plan all the meals, and they'd be all stored in the fridge. What you're seeing now is, and we see this reflected downtown, the Target that was built at Columbia Heights, DC, USA, that store does 3 times the volume of a typical Target in a suburban market. So a typical Target in a suburban market does $35 million. That store does $92 million a year. And it does it with 30% of the parking demand of a store doing $35 million. So you're seeing that an extreme example of how, even in the grocery world in particular, is people are rather than leaving with carts, they're leaving with bags, and they're going much more frequently during the week. So it's much more, say, European-based shopping habits, so we're adapting a finer grain. So when you're affecting parking demand and all these kind of components, the retail demand, the parking demand is not there. And you're seeing that in a lot of the lease negotiations where it had to be 5 per thousand pre-08. You're seeing a lot of flexibility in parking because basically half the parking in city center they don't know what to do with. It's vacant. True or false, 45% spend more than 1 hour a day looking at retail-oriented websites. True? True. You guys nailed that one. All right. So 45% spend at least 1 hour a day on retail-oriented websites. I mean, that's pretty significant when you think about it. You know, back when we had to physically shop, you know, it was much more selective and it was much more of a time commitment on the weekend. Now you're seeing, through the course of business in the evening, a lot of focus and research on retail and demand. And this reflects back to the merchants now are all responding to this. So this is one of the adaptive phases we're going through. It's not fully realized yet, but you're seeing a lot of change occurring, and it's this trend is driving that. True, false, 50% combine a shopping trip with a meal out. True? True. Okay, you guys are getting in the groove. So, yeah, 50% combined with a meal out. And, you know, the dining options, these are interesting. You know, 44% favor local or a neighborhood place. And that, remember when I was telling you about how a lot of the national restaurants aren't doing as well as the local and regional, is that your generations are really searching out more interesting and contextually based offerings and a much more diverse range of food. So, I mean, these are pretty significant trends. And we find within our portfolio, our regional tenants greatly outperform a lot of our national restaurants. So that's pretty interesting. True, false. Gen Ys are more likely to rent than buy. Who thinks more are going to rent? True. However, we have to be careful with this because I think this among the millennials and the X's too is morphing. So I think right now there's a trend towards renting, and not only renting apartments rather than owning, but renting cars. We have about 100 employees in our company. I'd say 60% of them are under the age of 30, and maybe 20% of them own a car, which, you know, John, I don't know when you had your license. I had my license when I was 16. You know, so there's definitely a focus from sort of renting a kind of lifestyle, but these trends, I think, in our opinion, are morphing. So you have to be a little careful about that. But certainly, you're seeing a lot of new offerings revolving around kind of this kind of sort of temporary ownership concept. In 5 years, the millennials, I don't know how significant that's going to be. You know, some are arguing they're going to morph back into more of a growth to the suburbs and a much more sort of prototypical kind of ownership pattern. But, you know, right now it's certainly a renting phenomenon. So final thoughts. What does this all mean? So I think the big takeaway from a lot of this is national and regional bricks and mortar are going to get smaller. I think online shopping, centralized distribution centers are really going to start to drive the size of stores, where you're going to see particularly a lot of the large and mid-sized format stores being smaller because they're not going to need to keep as much merchandise on site. So in power centers and that, and the other interesting thing that'll exacerbate is there's not a lot of new concepts coming out right now. So as tenants are leaving a lot of these more traditional centers, there's not a lot of tenants to backfill. So I think the fact that the stores are getting smaller and there's not a lot of new stores coming up, we're going to have to find innovative ways for this real estate, you know, what we're going to use in there, and introducing other uses to these areas. There's a greater correlation today, too, between the internet and store sales. What they're referring to this is omni-shopping, and it's what I was describing earlier. For instance, they take a merchant like REI. People will shop in the store, but they'll also, once they become accustomed to a certain product that they want to buy again, they'll shop online. And then if you take a concept like Best Buy, they're really working with what merchandise do I keep in the store, and what merchandise do I need, so that it's not all overlap. They don't want duplication. So this concept of omni-shopping is here, and right now it's still in the adaptive phase where people are trying to figure it out. What I've spent a lot of time on today, retail merchandise is really focusing now on immersive and experiential offerings, and I think much more focused on food and dining. We're seeing a lot of activity in entertainment, food, a lot less activity in specialty retail and fashion. Experience is king today. I think really you saw in the examples I documented that the performance of the environment has to be really focused on. So not only do we have to worry about the depth and widths and configuration of the stores, but what's happening on the street, sidewalks are really important. The ability for restaurants to have outdoor dining areas is really key, part of the leasing negotiations now, because not that they're trying to increase their seating capacity, but on a good spring night, people will decide to go to a restaurant because there are outdoor chairs. The extreme example of this is Lincoln Road. If you've ever been to South Beach, there's an equal amount of dining inside as outside. And in the summer, everybody's inside where the air conditioning, because it's 98 degrees and humid. And in what they call in season, which is in the winter, nobody's sitting inside, everybody's sitting outside. So it's not like they have twice the seating capacity. It's just that the seating is used differently, and I think restaurants look at a lot of that as having some outdoor component is really important, not for increasing their capacity, but increasing their capture. Neighborhood retail is still probably, is king as well and very relevant. I mean, I think we're seeing, again, the amount of, as it goes urban-based, there's a lot more foot traffic now rather than vehicular traffic. And I think people are tending, with the traffic issues and everything else we have here, people are tending to focus on the retail that live in their local and immediate environments much more than in the regional environments, so that, our focus particularly has been less at the regional centers and much more focused on the fine grain street environments throughout the region. And then the last point, which I think is really important, because in corridors like Boston, but really, and you're seeing it downtown, is retail to me in these markets is really becoming an amenity. And we're seeing a lot of discussions where pre-08 used to be, get me the best credit tenant you can find that's going to pay me the highest rent. And that would be from a mixed-use developer. What you're really seeing the conversation is, because there's so much competition now for that millennial renter, is what kind of retail can I get that will match the demands and aspirations of my tenant, so that, number one, I can be more competitive in my lease up and capture over another building, because I've got a great yoga studio, I've got a great kind of pet store, I've got a great wine or cheese bar. And the second thing that does is it also allows on retention, because basically in these luxury markets, which you're seeing in a lot of, that's rent, say, north of $3, the turnover in these buildings is up to 70% a year. So it costs these developers a lot of money with this constant turnover of tenants. So if they can get the right mix of retail that's amenitized for their patron, they can really increase, they can get that tenant to stay another year because they really like that dog cafe, and they have a real good social environment at grade. So I think what you're seeing now is co-tenancy is going both horizontal and vertical, and that's a really new trend. And it's really becoming prevalent in real estate, where the tenants are sort of aware of it, and the mixed-use developers are. So you're seeing a pretty prominent trend that way. And I think that, to me, is one of the most key things we need to pay attention moving forward, because it's just this correlation between the vertical use and the horizontal is really key. So thank you very much. Hope you got something out of this.